Clinton didn't really want. We all knew the rules of this game going in. The Electoral College establishes the rules of the game. That's the playing field we're playing on. We all knew that. And the Electoral College, because of the states and the winner take all, that whole system, Clinton did not win. But as we talk about, and I guess this is just presaging where we're going to go when we talk about white working class voters, as we talk about, this isn't the country we thought we had, we're a different place than we thought we were, the whole country is, it's important for everybody to, in their analysis, realize that in fact, more voters will have voted for Hillary Clinton in this presidential election than voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's still going to be the president of the United States. We have to understand the phenomenon that will put him into office. We have to understand why that supposed blue wall crumbled. But it's a mistake to say that this means that most of the country or all of the country, without accounting for the fact that more voters in the country will have chosen Secretary Clinton. However, here is where the Electoral College math becomes a very big deal. Clinton won by tiny margins in these states. Trump won. Trump won by very small margins in these states. Clinton won by overwhelming margins in some of her states, and particularly California, which is the most populous state in the union, and at this point is overwhelmingly Democratic, like enormously overwhelmingly Democratic. But the Electoral College system means that a vote in California above 51% doesn't counteract the vote in Wisconsin. And again, those are the rules. Everybody going in knew that those were the rules. So if you have an advantage of a few thousand votes or a few tens of thousands of votes in a number of states versus an advantage of 1 million votes in a state you already won anyway, right? Those extra 1 million votes or 2 million votes, they don't do any good. We all understand that. And so that is how the electoral math works out. So you look at this map, and of course Trump won, he got way more of the votes. Actually, Clinton got more votes. He got way more of the states. Now, what is going on in these states where the blue wall crumbled? What's going on in these states where the blue wall crumbled? So a sort of first take on election night was these white working class voters that we weren't paying attention to turned out in vast numbers to vote. That turned out not to be exactly true. This was a low turnout election. Trump got fewer votes in victory than either McCain or Romney got in defeat in 2008 or 2012. He got fewer votes in victory than either McCain or Romney got going down to defeat in 2008 and 12. But Hillary Clinton got many, many fewer votes than Barack Obama got. So this is not exactly about enormous numbers of previously non-mobilized voters of the Trump constituency turning out, as much as it is about large numbers of previously mobilized Obama voters sitting this one out, okay, and staying home. Having said that, well, let's not have said that. Let's stay there for a minute. Now, that doesn't mean, that is a general pattern. That is an overall national pattern. Local patterns still look different in some places. So for example, in Florida, we actually did see a substantial increase in the total number of votes cast. There were a lot more votes cast in Florida. So Florida is actually a place where we see both a surge in the Latino vote, but a surge in the Latino vote that was counteracted by a surge in that white non-college Trump vote. Okay, so that is actually, that phenomenon played out in Florida, but in much of the nation, you were actually looking at lower vote totals. And you saw that in particular, if you remember looking at Pennsylvania, right? Philadelphia on the east, Pittsburgh on the west, and Alabama in the middle. Philadelphia did not turn out to vote in the same numbers that it did for Obama. And that's a very interesting question as to why not, that people are going to try to understand and unpack. Okay? Philadelphia did not turn out to vote in the same numbers, and the same thing with Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So African American communities in urban areas that had turned out to vote in overwhelming numbers for Obama did not turn out in the same numbers for Clinton. Understanding why is going to be the next thing we move to talk about and figure out what's going on here, but let's talk about this for a few minutes. I want to back up for a minute and say something. Maybe I won't back up now. Maybe let's just work our way through this map and then we'll back up. So Florida is a higher turnout state, but Florida is a higher turnout state that goes for Trump. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, lower turnout states. I don't remember if we talked about this last time, but it is significant. I don't think we did. You'll remind me if we did. In 2013, the Supreme Court rendered a decision in a case called Shelby County versus Holder that probably contributed to swinging the outcome in this election. And Shelby County versus Holder was a case that undid some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And because it undid some of the provisions of Voting Rights Act of 1965, it allowed states to change voting rules and voting procedures in a way that they would not have been able to do if the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was still fully in place. Okay? So let's back up. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was meant to ensure that African Americans had access to the polls. And in order to do so, it put into place an unusual and really kind of extreme remedy to what until then had been the practice in many states of depriving African Americans and other minorities of voting rights. And that is, it said, that in states that have a history, in states or counties, it didn't have to be whole states, that had histories of depriving people of voting rights on account of race, in those states and counties, if they wanted to change their voting procedures in any way, they had to go to the United States Justice Department first, tell the Justice Department what they planned to do, and get permission to do it before they did it. That's called pre-clearance. And so a whole bunch of states were covered by pre-clearance, including a whole bunch of states in the American South, also including parts of New York City, interestingly enough. That's a different story. And if you were covered by pre-clearance, you can't change your voting rules or procedures without the federal government's permission. Now remember, in the United States, we don't carry out one national election, as strange as that might sound to you. We carry out 50 state elections, plus the District of Columbia. We carry out 51 different elections. Some states have early voting, some states don't. Some states have vote by mail, some states don't. Some states let you do this, some states let you do that. And so states that had a history of discriminating on the basis of race were limited in how they changed their voting procedures until they got permission from the Justice Department, because the concern was otherwise they would change voting procedures in a way to make it harder for African Americans to vote. In 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court ruled that continuing that pre-clearance was unconstitutional, because pre-clearance was based on which states were civil rights violators in 1965 when the law was passed. And the Supreme Court said it's not 1965 anymore, it's 2013, and everything is different. And you can't base pre-clearance anymore on what was going on in 1965. And so they threw out pre-clearance. They said if you want to pass a new pre-clearance provision that's responsive to the current situation, you can, but you cannot keep the old pre-clearance provision. There was no chance that the House and the Senate in 2013 were going to pass the new pre-clearance. This was the first presidential election since the presidential election in 1964 that took place without the pre-clearance provision in effect, preventing changes to voting rules. A number of states instituted changes to voting rules that were likely to make it more difficult for younger voters, for poorer voters, for minority voters to vote. What you can do now still is you can go to court, challenge those rules, and try to get the rules thrown out. And so now you have voting rights lawyers all over the country doing that. In some places they succeeded, in some places they didn't. And so Wisconsin had a new voter ID law on the books that resulted in a significant number of people who had voted in the past not being able to vote in this election. And North Carolina had a set of new restrictions on the books, including limiting early voting hours, cutting number of polling places, and things like that. And so another thing that people who are looking at this election say that those states that had those new provisions on the books that may have prevented certain groups of voters from being able to vote, so that too may have swung the vote in those states. Chris Hayes, who wrote the book Twilight of the Elites that I told you about in the first session, Chris Hayes tweeted sometime yesterday that in a game in which you win or lose by 1 point, every point is the deciding point. And what he meant by that is in an election that's so close, everything is decisive. And so what we're looking at now is a kind of the blind man and the elephant phenomenon. in which everyone points to the one thing that they think did it, and the answer is that one thing did it, but so did this one thing, and so did this one thing, and so did this one thing. Because 100,000 votes in total, landing differently between Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the election would have gone the other way. It's 100,000 votes in the 3 states combined. The election would have gone the other way. So when you're talking about margins like that, so some people are saying, you know, Hillary Clinton wasn't the right candidate for the time. She was way too establishment. She was way too centrist, and that's one critique. Another critique is, you know, James Comey and the FBI letter 11 days before the election. Another critique is Bernie Sanders' campaign where he attacked Clinton for so long and so vociferously, those attacks stopped. Another complaint is the media didn't cover Trump's problems, they only covered the email. Another complaint is Hillary's campaign never went to Wisconsin until they just assumed Wisconsin was safe and they never went to that. And none of those is right, and every one of those is right. Because had any one of those things played out differently, potentially the election could have played out differently. And so everyone is going to look at that and find confirmation of what they want to find about the election outcomes. Yes, that makes sense to you? So there are many, when we're talking about you know, hair's breadth margins here, so any one of the things that could have moved the hair's breadth would have been decisive, and so a lot of people are pointing to different things based on what they would like to think is decisive. People are pointing to different things as being decisive, and the truth is they're all decisive. Because between these 3 states, we're talking about a tiny number of votes. That's won the election. Okay. There was not, as often happens when you get a strong sort of trend at the presidential level, it carries on down ballot as well. And so it wasn't just not a good night for the Democrats at the presidential level, it wasn't a good night for the Democrats at the Senate level as well. So for example, there was a competitive Senate race in Wisconsin. The Democratic candidate lost that as well. There was a competitive Senate race in North Carolina. The Democratic candidate lost that as well. So there were a whole bunch of down ballot races, particularly Senate races. The Democrats had hoped to maybe take back the Senate. That didn't transpire. But Nevada was actually a bright spot for Democrats, and it's interesting to talk about why that was. Nevada was a bright spot for Democrats because of a significant mobilization of the Latino vote, which we spoke about. And so that sense that the Latino vote is now going to start to swing states that had previously been safe red, that may yet be coming, but it seems like it was a little premature to conclude that it was going to happen now. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But we did see it happen in Nevada. The other thing that happened in Nevada is that a couple of strong unions in Las Vegas were very active in driving to get out the vote and voter registration. Unions were once a core set of foot soldiers for the Democratic Party. Union volunteers who would do registration work, who would do get out the vote work, who would canvass for the Democratic Party. As the union movement in America in general has weakened, the role of unions as Democratic actors in the election has weakened, and we saw that overall in this election. We saw the weakest union turnout for Democrats that we've seen really since unions started to be a factor in elections, but Nevada is an exception to that rule. So to the extent that the Democrats want to take sort of any glimmer of hope from that, that might be it, but really it was not a good night for Democrats. I'll say one or two more things and then I'll go back to our bigger. There were a couple of states in which Democratic women of color entered the Senate, and that's actually an interesting phenomenon. So an African-American woman senator in California, a Latina senator in Nevada, and an Asian-American, also Democratic woman senator in Illinois. And that may yet be what the next generation of party leadership looks like. Younger Democrats, not all white, but right now, again, the Democratic Party is spending a lot of time figuring out which end is up and regrouping. Now, when it comes to interpreting what message is being sent to us by election outcomes, what message is being sent to us by the vote, you have all heard a lot of election coverage that talks about the unheard white working class voter, that talks about the elites, that talks about the weaknesses within the Democratic Party's process and way of doing things and approach. Before we get into that conversation, and we will, I want to raise something that pollster Nate Silver of 538.com said. And Nate Silver and 538.com are notable in that among the polling aggregators, he was the one who gave Donald Trump the highest chance to win. So he, and everybody was saying, you're nuts. He was actually getting attacked online for other aggregators were saying, the New York Times was saying 80-some-odd% chance of Clinton victory. Someone, I forgot who, was saying 98% chance of Clinton victory. And he had it about a 2/3 chance of Clinton victory, 1/3 chance of Trump victory, which means that's a very real possibility. So come Wednesday morning, Nate Silver was looking pretty good, and people are once again committed to listening to Nate Silver. He blew it on the nomination. He said that Trump wouldn't get the nomination, and that was a sort of famous little bit of brouhaha, and he had to apologize for that. And he said the reason we got it wrong was instead of looking at the polling data, we kind of went with our gut. We went with what we thought or what we felt, oh no, it can't be. So he said, I'm done going with my gut now, I'm going to go with what the data tell me, and his interpretation of the data led him to conclude that in fact Trump had a much bigger chance than most people were seeing or saying. So Trump speaks a lot of credibility on Wednesday morning, and Silver speaks a lot of credibility on Wednesday morning, and Silver said, don't overinterpret the results of this election. To say, you know, the Democratic Party is slaughtered, the American people are in a different place than you thought, all these kinds of things. He said you're drawing very, very broad conclusions from 100,000 voters in these 3 states. When in fact, had 100,000 voters gone the other way, the whole election would have turned out differently. So these sweeping conclusions about who America is and what Americans are, said Nate Silver, is not a valid conclusion. That's true, and it's not true at the same time, and it's important to recognize it. Meaning it is true as a factual matter. That small number of votes had gone differently, the election would have turned out differently. It is true as a factual matter that more Americans voted for Clinton than for Trump. So in that sense, you could say, don't overinterpret this election and what it means and what it says. But on the other hand, the Republican Party will now have unified control of the entire federal government. The House, the Senate, the White House, the Supreme Court. They will be in a position to enact their desired policies and positions. In fact, while you can talk about just how narrow and just a hair and just 100,000 votes and it could have gone the other way and don't overinterpret, that's true. But it's also true that we are now looking at one party with an up and down lock on the federal government and actually substantial gains at the state level on Tuesday night as well. Most governors are Republican governors, most state governments are in Republican hands. And so in that sense, to say, well, a hair could have gone the other way, that's true, but guess what? It didn't. And the reality that we are going to watch play out on the ground right now is a reality of Republican dominance of national and state politics. Now, we have seen in the past substantial swings in Congress in midterm congressional elections. So on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe the Democrats will come roaring back and take Congress in 2018. But we talked about how the distribution of Democrats in this country does make Congress, and particularly the Senate, an uphill fight for Democrats, right? The Senate is hard because if you think about each of these red states having 2 senators, and each of these blue states having 2 senators, you can see that even if the blue states, again, have more voters who voted blue than the red states have voters who voted red, when it comes to the Senate, you see how difficult the math is. And if you remember our Pennsylvania map, the same thing. The distribution of blue voters in a very concentrated way in a couple of congressional districts, leaving a lot of congressional districts to be red, creates a difficult mathematics in the House as well. Just to remind us, the entire House is up for election every 2 years. So the whole House was up for election this year, and the whole House will be up for election in 2018. A third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. A Senate term is a 6-year term, but you can be in from 2012 to 2018, you can be in from 2014 to 2020, you can be in from 2016 to 2022. So the senators you voted for, so in New York State, we voted for Chuck Schumer this year, he won't be up for election again until 22. No 2 of the state senators in general are up for re-election at the same time. They put them in what are called classes. They're rolling classes. So the senators in a given state are staggered, so they don't come up for re-election at the same time. So for people who are, seeking to make encouraging noises to the Democrats, saying, well, don't overinterpret this election, it could have easily gone the other way, again, totally mathematically true, and at the same time, in terms of the political impact, totally irrelevant, right? If a miss is as good as a mile, winning by a hair is as good as winning by a landslide, especially if you also have House, Senate, and Supreme Court. So both of those things are true, and it's important to understand both of them in terms of thinking about all these think pieces and analyses and belly button gazing and where are we as a country, that may be true, but in terms of political and policy outcomes, a narrow win is as good as a really big win, and the Republican Party has that win. Okay. Now, I didn't say we were going to talk about this, but I actually want to talk about this a little bit. Well, I said we were going to talk about it at the end, looking forward to a Trump presidency, so maybe let's leave that. That's part of Trump presidency, and let's instead talk now about the white working class a little bit. Okay, so I want to make sure that we all are with me, because we're doing a lot of things here, and that it seems to be coherent. The first thing we did is look at the election outcomes. What happened? How did it happen? We said the question of how did it happen is essentially a lot of different hows, right? If turnout were higher, if African Americans turned out, if Clinton were a more charismatic figure, if the emails, if. So there are a lot of different hows. And you can, in a close election, you can emphasize, anyone you want. We talked about what the overall picture looks like for the parties, and we talked about both Nate Silver's caution against overemphasizing what happened, at that same time realizing that it creates a reality, however narrowly or broadly it creates a reality. That is now the political reality. I said white working class, but before we do that, let's talk for a few minutes about polling. Okay, so everybody wants to know, how did we get such a catastrophic failure of political polling? And since really there were not polls that predicted, people point to the LA Times tracking poll that tended Trump in the election, but the LA Times tracking poll, not to spend too much time here, had some clearly identified problems with it that led it to be leaning Trump. It wasn't leaning Trump because it was right, it was leaning Trump because it had certain problems in its design. All of the polls that were supposed to be the well-designed scientific polls missed this. How'd they miss it? Right? They missed this in a big way. How'd they miss it? So here are a few things. Nate Silver wrote a piece, it's sort of in defense of polling. The first thing he said is, we always tell you guys we have a margin of error, right? And you ignore the margin of error, and you act like the numbers came down off the mountaintop. And these are the numbers. He pointed out the polling ended off in 2012 with President Obama up over Mitt Romney by like 0.7%. It was supposed to be super, super, super close. And in fact, President Obama's margin of victory was about 3 percentage points. It was about 2.3 percentage points higher than what the polls predicted, which makes total sense because that's within the error in polling. So it goes the other way. If we predicted an outcome for Hillary Clinton that was 2.5 percentage points higher, we said, she's 3.5 points ahead, and she ends up a point ahead, we actually, I know, don't all shoot me, people, says Nate Silver, but we didn't get this wrong. We told you what our numbers were, we told you what the margin of error was, and actually it was within our margin of error. So yeah, that's one thing. The other thing, though, I believe we talked about this, is that a poll is only as good as its statistical model. Whom do you think is going to turn out? And here, the notable story is the significant decline in turnout of voters who voted for President Obama in 2008 and 2012. That significant decrease, there were fewer Obama voters in 12 than in 8. 8 was really a high turnout election, but significantly fewer even than that now. And so that's a big piece of the story. That voters not, so if you predicted based on the past 2 elections who was likely to vote, and then those people didn't, well, that would explain the change in outcome. Yes?
In 2008, I think, there was this huge turnout because he was the first African-American candidate. Women did not turn out the same way, in the same kind of margins from what I've been reading for Clinton.
Oh, great, we're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
Absolutely, that question ties into some of our questions about the white working class.
Oh.
Who did vote, who didn't vote, how they voted, how we understand how they voted, so we're gonna get to that. Okay, great. Polling. If your sample, if your prediction of who's gonna vote, and therefore your sample made up of people you expect to vote is skewed, your polls are not going to be right. There's also some suggestion that I've heard that white working class voters are less likely to respond to pollsters and less likely to engage. That doesn't really explain polling error, because if you know you need X number of white working class voters, you gotta keep calling people's numbers until you get them. Do you understand what I'm saying? You don't just say, oh, they hung up on me, so I'm not including them in my sample. My sample's only gonna be people who talk to me. You keep going until you get them. There might be other sources of error in your polling. Are you using all these questions, cell phones, landlines, all these other kinds of things. But response bias may be some of it, but I don't really think that response bias is the big story here. Who does or doesn't respond? And the assumption that people were afraid to say that they were voting for Trump. I That's not an explanation that I find. First of all, that so-called Bradley effect, that term is called the Bradley effect after a candidate for mayor of LA who, the suggestion was that people told the pollsters they were voting for an African-American candidate because they wanted to sort of seem to be enlightened to pollsters, but actually in the polling booth, they didn't vote for the African-American, they voted for the white candidate, and the white candidate won, and that got assigned to the Bradley effect, and people talk about that. Statisticians aren't even sure that the Bradley effect in that case was a real thing. That does not seem to be a huge factor. Certainly, lots of voters were very comfortable saying, lots of voters were, people who were polled were comfortable saying they were voting for Trump. It really seems to be more about who showed up on election day. And again, sometimes the who showed up was who chose to show up, and sometimes in some states the who showed up was about laws that made it more difficult to show up. But in both cases, who showed up on election day.
Is there a difference between exit polls and the polling before?
Yes, exit polling is much less reliable. You should know that. Exit polling, for many reasons, is much less reliable. It is much more difficult to ensure you have a good sample in exit polling, and that's a place where refusing to answer can just skew your sample. And on the one hand, we do rely on exit polling, and I'm going to refer to it when we talk about those voters, because it's the data that we have, and on the other hand, it's much less reliable. So sort of a little bit of grain of salt, and it's hard because we're going to use the data because it's the data we have at the same time that I'm telling you a grain of salt about the data we're using. But exit polling is much less reliable. The other thing that Nate Silver says that's worth noting is that the national polls were always better than the state polls. So the overall national polls ended with a narrow Clinton lead, where the narrow lead in the popular vote that she ended up with would have been within the margin of error in those polls. The state polls were much worse. So for example, if you go to Real Clear Politics and look at the Wisconsin polls, as I did, every poll in Wisconsin from July until before election day is a Clinton lead. Every single one. So that's a state poll that, whether because it got the sample wrong, it got the voters wrong, it got it wrong. Okay, the same thing in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania polls, the worst Pennsylvania poll that I saw was one tie. Otherwise, Pennsylvania polls were consistently 4 to 9 points Clinton lead. And again, the Pennsylvania polls were wrong, and they were probably wrong because they didn't correctly model turnout in what turned out to be, that's too many times using the word turnout in a sense. They didn't correctly model turnout in what ended up being a low turnout year. Okay? So that's a little bit about sort of understanding what we're seeing here and what we're looking at. Now, I want to talk a little bit about our voters, our white working class voters, our white non-working class voters, our women. I want to talk about all those people. And then I'd like to go on and talk a little bit about looking forward. So, we talked about this in our first session, and I think it no less true today than I did when I said it to you in our first session. There is a whole debate going on in the community of disappointed Democrats as to whether you have it's like a race-class divide. The Democrats who are looking at things, well, it's race and gender on one side and class on the other side. The Democrats who are looking at things through the lens of class are saying, yeah, you know what? These are people who have the legitimate complaints that we spoke about in the first session, right? The banks drove this country to a ditch in 2008, and the Democrats and the Republicans stood together to bail out the banks and bail out the wealthy bankers, and little people got their homes foreclosed. The Democrats and the Republicans stood together to support free trade and sign NAFTA and negotiate free trade deals, and the little people saw the factories leave and the jobs go away. And so the people who are looking at this with class-based analysis are saying there is a real important critique of how elites function in this sort of body politic embedded in this voting outcome, and we all had better start paying attention to it and hearing it. And those people are saying, the Clinton problem is that she was herself a part of this elite class for so long. And she had given the speeches and taken the money and seemed to be in the pocket and the big donors and was open to those tax and all those things. And that was the sort of core problem here, and that's who those voters are. They are these masses rising up against the elite, the disaffected, you didn't hear me, can you hear me now voters, okay? What supports this contention? One thing that supports this contention is that there are quite a lot of voters in these states who voted Obama in 08 and 12, who voted Trump on Tuesday night. So the argument that they're racist is a little bit of a, right? We're gonna go to the race class people in a minute. is a little bit of a difficult argument to square with the fact they voted for Obama twice and now they're voting for Trump. And so that datum seems to give support to the argument that what really was going on here is the sense, I voted for you twice, and I don't know, but things have not gotten better for me, and it seems like all you all have worked this thing out in Washington, everybody scratches each other's back, and it's all good for you, and it's not good for me. Let's drain the swamp, let's burn the whole thing down. So that's the evidence that seems to support that interpretation of these voters and who they are. Yes? Roll with me. Okay. There is another group, which is sort of, I'm lumping together the race and gender group, who say that what we are seeing in this country is a profound white backlash to the threat of an increasingly diverse United States in which white people are already not a majority of the babies born in the United States, and in a relatively short time frame will not be a majority of the people in the United States. And those people, says this other analysis, are increasingly threatened by a country in which diversity of languages, diversity of religions, diversity of racial and ethnic backgrounds, where LGBT rights and marriage are accepted. All of these things are sort of threatening to your old white people, and they voted to undo or to take back or to, that is the other. So I have seen people saying things, like, now women know how much all of America hates them, that kind of, or half of America hates them, that kind of thing. Now, I told you in our first session that I have a very hard time buying that as the singular explanation for what's going on here. I have no doubt that there is truth to that idea of a white backlash and a male backlash and a white male backlash. I'm sure there is some of that going on. I have a very hard time believing that that accounts for 59 million or whatever it is Trump voters. Again, particularly given that some of those Trump voters are double Obama voters. And it's not just like wishful thinking because I don't want to believe it. I also think that that's an explanation that allows people who are members of certain elites to lay the blame at the feet of those voters rather than saying, let's look at how the system has been working for the past 40 years. It's worked for me, it's worked for everybody else. However, at the same time, to be intellectually honest, I want to tell you that there is some evidence to support those claims. Now, it's important to realize, I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you're talking about a body of almost 60 million people, you can have a lot of people motivated by economic concerns and still have room left over for a bunch of people motivated by other things, right? When you're talking about a body of 60 million people, it's not inconsistent to say 45 million of them or 50 million of them, make up whatever number you want, since we don't know, are motivated by these kinds of the elite failure and the mass revolt concerns, and still to say that there are plenty of people who are motivated by these other concerns. So let's talk about some of the evidence to suggest, even though, again, I don't accept that as the unitary explanation for what's going on here, but there's no question that's motivating some people, and let's talk about it. First of all, there is some data to suggest that the best predictor of everything, of somebody's being a Trump supporter, if you look at all the data, what predicts someone being a Trump supporter? Their economic status, their views on this, that. The best data to predict someone's being a Trump supporter is their views on women. So that might suggest that there were some people who are simply deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a woman head of state, of a woman commander-in-chief. That is supported by evidence that shows, if you look at the numbers that show Trump getting more minority support than Obama, and you're like, I'm sorry, no. More minority support than Romney. You're like, what, huh? How does that make sense? He was running the campaign he was running, and he got more minority votes than Romney? The answer is, when you break that down demographically, it's minority men. And that's very interesting because it suggests that there might have been men who said, Trump, but I'm really not comfortable with the idea of a woman head of state, a woman commander-in-chief, I'm going to vote for Trump. And that might explain. Now, the reason why we have to be careful with that is because this data about more minority support for Trump and breaking down by men, this is all exit polling data. And I've told you that exit polling data can be challenging and compromised in the way that it's challenging and compromised. Nevertheless, we're going to work with it because it's the best data we got. And that's very interesting to see that minority men facing the choice of voting for a woman commander-in-chief, not all of them, again, still overwhelmingly minorities voted for Clinton, but not more overwhelmingly than they voted for Obama, actually less overwhelmingly than they voted for Obama. So that would be one piece of evidence that would suggest, that would support that being at least a factor here in the election. The other thing that's interesting to talk about that is to talk about what happened with college-educated whites in general and college-educated white women in particular. College-educated whites are a group that has always, not always, but the recent past has skewed Republican. College-educated whites skew Republican. That's not where the Democrats are building their lead. Polling in this election consistently along the way suggested that college-educated whites, particularly college-educated white women, were turning away from Trump and were prepared to support Clinton. At the end of the day, that didn't happen all that much. College-educated women did, by a small margin, go for Clinton over Trump. It was 53% went for, actually I take that back, because that 53% white women, that 53% might be all white women, not college-educated white women. They went for Trump, they went for Clinton by a small margin. So a student of mine, a whole bunch of former students of mine were contacting me yesterday. So he said, well, she couldn't do better performance than 53% with these women. I said to him, well, actually, Obama lost those women. Romney won those women. Romney won. So she actually did do better, but she didn't do hugely better, overwhelmingly better, bigger enough better to make up for her losses in other areas. So yes, she did do better with women, but those college-educated white women who tend to vote Republican voted a little less Republican, but not overwhelmingly less Republican, and men, white men, overwhelmingly, by enormous margins, preferred Trump over Clinton. So that's an interesting data point, because that suggests that some notion of, either gender solidarity with Clinton, celebrating the first woman president, or reacting against some of the things Trump has said and done to women, didn't drive an enormous amount of those women's votes. It drove some of it, but it didn't drive an enormous amount of it. How you read that is going to go back to what your lens is, because some people have said, well, you're looking at sort of class solidarity. I'm voting my economic class interests more than I'm voting my gender interests. And other people have read that as white women are voting their racial solidarity. They're voting as white in this sort of white backlash vote that's going with Trump more than they're voting their gender. Again, we don't know these things. We don't have a way of going to 100 million voters and saying, how did you vote and why? And so what you have is a lot of analysts sort of reading into it what they want to read into it, and you can see people out there saying, this is all about, and this is all about. One more thing that's worth pointing out that I said to you when we talked about the white working class the first time, but this was borne out in the exit polling data. When we talk about class-based appeals, remember, we are talking about white, non-college, who may have been able to have middle-class lives for themselves without college, but are uncertain as to what the future looks like for their kids, are concerned. That is borne out by the fact that Clinton won the two lowest income brackets in the United States. The two lowest income brackets went for Clinton. Every income bracket above that went for Trump. Now, understand that went for means, low 50% to high 40%. We're not talking about 100 and 0 or 92 and 8. But still, Clinton carried. She got more than half of the lowest two income brackets in the United States. That's up to $50,000 a year. And the income brackets that start with $50,000 and more and go all the way up to $250,000 and more, Trump carried all of it. So that's an interesting reflection on, I'm sorry? That's an interesting reflection on the fact that, again, remember, these class-based appeals of Trump's are not class-based appeals to the poorest of the poor, particularly since the poorest of the poor also are more likely to be minority, and they were voting for Clinton in overwhelming numbers. Again, remember the fact that I said they weren't voting for Clinton in more overwhelming numbers than they voted for Obama doesn't mean they weren't voting for in overwhelming numbers. She got 80-some-odd% of the black vote, it looks like, and almost 70% of the Hispanic vote. So still overwhelming numbers, even if not more overwhelming. So those lowest income voters tended towards Clinton. It was middle income voters and higher who tended towards Trump. Just to summarize what I think, and this I am telling you is an interpretation. It is an interpretation. Other people have interpreted this differently. I told you there are a range of points of view out there. But my interpretation of this would be that there was a significant segment of that American white, non-college educated class concentrated in these states that, again, had been seen as the Rust Belt states that had been seen as the so-called blue wall, many of whom might actually have voted for Obama at some point, who felt like government was not responsive to their interests, issues, and needs, and who voted for Trump to drain the swamp. that actually is confirmed by the fact that voters all the way through, by substantial margins, said they viewed Clinton as more qualified to be president than Trump. Substantial margins, they viewed Clinton to be more qualified as President Trump. And based on the numbers, based on how many voters said they viewed Trump as not qualified to be president, there had to have been quite a few voters who saw Trump as not qualified to be president who voted for him anyway. 62% of voters said that they saw Trump as not qualified to be president. He got more than 39% of the vote. A lot more. That means there was a significant percentage of voters who said that and voted for him anyway, which I think gives a sense of how much they thought the bar needed to be burned down, the swamp needed to be drained, the system needed to be challenged. Having said that, I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that I'm not trying to minimize or paper over the extent to which race-based appeals and sexist appeals still carry weight in the United States, and I'm not trying to pretend that those things were not a factor. Certainly, there was a significant segment of the voting population that committed themselves to believing for quite a few years that President Obama wasn't eligible to be president. They're in the mix as well. But to offer that as the sole explanation for the Trump phenomenon, again, I'm going to say this, seems to me to be missing something important, and something important that sort of, turns a critical lens on what the elites have been doing or not doing. But I'm not trying to take that off the table as a factor. It clearly was a factor, both race and gender. But when I see columns like the past two elections have proven to us that Americans hate women more than they hate African Americans, I'm like, okay, everybody simmer down. I think we need a little bit more of a sophisticated analytical framework than that. I think we need to acknowledge the real pain and of the. I told you the Steve Schmidt saying this was still part of the hangover from the 2008 crash, and the uncertainty and the lack of meaningful recovery. And so without minimizing race and gender as factors here, I certainly don't see them as sole explanations for that phenomenon. Let me take your question and I'll talk about moving forward, then we can take general questions.
I'm not sure how I feel about my own question, but is it possible that some of that may be attributed to a sense that somehow the office of presidency is not as important? In the sense that, we've had a stymied Congress, we've had a very aggressive congressional presence in the last 8 years under Obama, where he's constantly been met and in many cases held back, and then every time in certain views he's overcome, be it Obamacare, it's been a failure. Maybe this is some sort of attempt to reduce the presidency in some way?
So I think that's a little bit too much of like a bank
too
shot, a
thoughtful.
triple bank shot, and I'll tell you why. If Donald Trump wanted to be running on a platform of, let's restore power to Congress, which the framers saw as the primary branch, let's get the executive in check, he could have done that. Instead, he ran on a platform of, I alone can fix it. Right, that was his line from his convention speech. So he in fact was running on a vision of a very, very powerful executive who was powerful enough to drain the swamp, clean up the mess. I'm the one who knows I was an insider, I know how they rigged the system, I'm gonna come and be your voice, I'm gonna speak for you. So while one, sort of might offer that explanation, I don't think it's consistent with the sort of campaign that he ran and the appeals that he was making. There was one more thing that I had wanted to say in terms of data that we have from the outcome, and I'm not remembering it right now, so I'm going to move on to looking forward a little bit, and then we'll take questions. Okay? Here is an important thing to say. It's not just that the pollsters were wrong about this election. Everybody was wrong about everything. And that is an important thing in terms of looking forward and taking stock and thinking about it. Campaign professionals have all these truths. Clinton ran, whatever people are going to say afterwards about why she lost, she ran a textbook campaign. She did everything you were supposed to do. And it didn't work. She raised way more money than he did. She ran way more ads than he did. Her ads were much higher quality and much better made than his were. He didn't have a ground game. You remember all I talked about ground game, a whole turnout operation to get voters to the polls. She had a very mobilized ground game. he had this random collection of yahoos and then that random collection of yahoos running his campaign. He fired this one, he fired that one, he fired the next one. He had people who'd never run a campaign before running his campaign. He had one guy from Breitbart News and a pollster running his campaign. Nobody there knows what they're doing. She had seasoned campaign professionals who had the whole thing down to a science running her campaign. This is an election that, aside from everything else, blows up all the truths of politicking, of campaign running, more broadly of some of the things that political scientists have thought about campaigns. I mean, it's a staggering thing to say ads don't make a difference, campaign structure doesn't make a difference, get out the vote doesn't. I mean, these are wild things to say. And yet in the aftermath of, I mean, I suppose you could say without the get out the vote, her loss would have been greater, right? They're staggering things to say, and yet we are left. And and I certainly saw, and I think it's right to say, some people who had been aggressively anti-Trump, Republican campaign professionals, who had been aggressively never Trump, and who had been talking the whole campaign about how these guys don't know how to run a campaign, they can't find a bee from a bullseye, they don't know which end is up. And I saw some of them on Twitter on Wednesday saying, mad props to you guys over there in Trump Tower, because at the end of the day, you did it, and all the stuff we were saying was wrong. Now it's interesting because the Trump campaign's internal polls weren't predicting a win either. The Trump campaign wasn't expecting a win. The RNC wasn't expecting a win. It's not that they knew what was coming. They didn't know what was coming either. But at the end of the day, the completely unconventional, from the gut, instinctive campaign being run by Donald Trump beat the super expert, all the wheels are greased, everything that followed every bit of conventional wisdom about how you run a campaign. Why do I put this in the going forward sort of piece of this conversation? Because I think it is important to realize that not having come up through the conventional channels of politics, not having gotten the full-throated and wholehearted endorsement or support of his party leadership, not having gotten the financial support of most of his party's big donors, not having come up through the professional political class, of handlers and managers and everybody who knows what they're doing, he doesn't owe anything to anybody. He is not bound by any of the normal, you came up through the system and you owe, these are your people, they've supported you, you gotta do what they want. He is a complete free agent to structure his government as he sees fit and to pursue the policies that he sees fit. And so what you're seeing now is people trying desperately to figure out what on earth that means. Right? What on earth does that mean? And people kind of cherry picking from the whole campaign what they want to hear to try to interpret it. So, Hillary Clinton had these enormously planned out policy statements, these extensive policy statements on her website that laid out all of her steps, so you could say, if she's elected, I at least know what she wants to do. Donald Trump spent a lot of time talking about building a wall and Mexico paying for it. He also said at some point it might not be a real wall, it might be a virtual wall, there might be security cameras, whatever. He also said at one point the US would pay for it and Mexico will pay us back eventually. Donald Trump talked about deporting all undocumented immigrants, and he talked about only deporting the criminals, and he talked about having a deportation force, and he talked about doing it humanely. And there's no formalized policy proposal that you could say, here's what he plans to do. So the people who want to say, everybody, get your paper bag, stop hyperventilating, take a few deep breaths, it's not going to be as bad as all that, are pointing to, he says he's a negotiator, this is his opening bid in a negotiation, he's going to bargain down from there, right? It's not going to be that bad. And then there are other people who are looking at others of the things he has said and saying it's going to be a catastrophe. He's going to do this, and he's going to do that, and he's going to do the other. And of course the real truth is, we don't know. We don't know, nobody else knows, he's not a conventional Republican by any stretch of the imagination. We don't really have a terribly good idea as to what's coming. And so we are now in a position, as is the rest of the country, as frankly I think is the Trump infrastructure. I'm not sure they know what they're going to do about all these things either. Everybody having to sort of watch and see as all of this gets figured out in real time, because the normal apparatus of coming up through a Republican Party, you would have signed on to certain beliefs about taxes, you would have signed on to certain beliefs about immigration, you would have signed on to certain beliefs about free trade. He hasn't signed on to those things. He didn't come up through that system. He doesn't owe most of those donors anything, and so what will happen remains to be seen. So one of my students, and you've been hearing all kinds of conciliatory statements from various Democratic leaders saying he's now all of our president and we have to work with him, which is of course true. We've also seen already protests by young people, but not only young people, out in the streets protesting against this administration and what it might mean to do. One of my students today said to me, isn't that not fair? They don't know what he's going to do yet. They haven't given him a chance. How are you protesting? So I said, look, the same way I don't know what 120 million voters are thinking, I don't know what a few tens of thousands of protesters are thinking. I said, but I could surmise that this is not about the policies he's going to do. It's about things that have already happened, things he's already done, ways he has spoken about groups of Americans over the course of his campaign, attitudes and approaches he has taken. And I said, and the act of protesting in the street is actually a profoundly patriotic act, because you are saying, I accept. The people have spoken, democracy has worked, you are now my president, and now I, according to the First Amendment, have a right to petition government for redress of grievances. And I don't like the way you spoke about Mexican people, or Muslims, or women, or LGBT, whatever. And so I am now going to march in the street as a patriotic American, accepting that you're my president. I'm going to petition government for redress of grievances. What I want to caution as strongly as I possibly can against, and then I'll stop for questions, is any of this like hashtag not my president. Yeah, no. You can't say that you believe in democracy when you win and not when you don't win. That's not called believing in democracy. You can't say you accept the rules of the game until the game doesn't go the way you want, and then you don't accept the rules of the game. You can't say she really won because she won the popular vote. Those aren't the rules of the game. They're not the rules of the game. We all knew what the rules of the game were. And at the end of the day, I told my students on election day, we didn't talk about the election at all. On the election day, I gave them a poem from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass to read about election day in 1884, and then he talks about the powerfulest thing in the United States. It's not Niagara, and it's not the Grand Canyon, and it's not the Cascade Mountains. The powerfulest thing in the United States, he says, that still small voice, echoing the words in the Navi, that talks about God's voice, right? The still small voice of that voter going into the polling place and casting a ballot. And if you believe in that, whatever you think of the other outcome, and wherever you are, you have to believe in that, however it comes. So protesting is a patriotic thing to do, and it is a constitutional right. Any of this, delegitimating the process or its outcome works against the shared belief in democracy that is what defines our political system when we like the way it goes and when we don't like the way it goes. I said to my students, you're like a whole 19, 20, the former students who got in touch with me, you're a whole 19, 20 years old. You've never seen an election go differently than you wanted it to go. Guess what, kiddo? Life. Everybody who's my age, whatever your political views are, has seen elections go not the way you wanted them to go. And legislative disappointments and setbacks. And you believe in something, so you work for it, and you keep working for it. You don't say, well, the system didn't go the way I want, I'm taking my marbles and going home. So if you want to make aliyah, kol hakavod to you. But disappointment with the American political system is not, aliyah should be a choice for aliyah, not because I'm disappointed in the American political system or running away. If we believe in the system, we believe in the system. When it cuts our way, when it doesn't cut our way, and we engage, and we work within it, and we don't delegitimate the outcome, and we don't delegitimate the president-elect of the United States. Okay, questions? Yes.
At the very beginning, when you said, which is true, the executive branch is Republican, legislature is Republican, Supreme Court is Republican, state house is Republican, state government happens to checks and balances.
Okay, so you know what? All the way back in the distant days of the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, we had the same thing. And you know what? George W. Bush proposed privatizing Social Security. Do you remember that? People don't even remember it. That was his big plan for his second term. He campaigned on privatizing Social Security. He didn't call it privatizing because the voters reacted badly to that word. He called it individual accounts. And liberals, for various reasons that I don't want to go into now, thought that was a disastrous idea. And he got elected, and he's got a mandate, and he's going to privatize Social Security, and he's got everything he needs to make it happen. And you know what happened? There was a grassroots mobilization of people who started calling their congressmen and nudging their, are you supporting him? Are you supporting him? There were a bunch of congressmen who wanted to avoid it. It's like all those congressmen who didn't want to say if they were voting Trump or not. They didn't really want to say, they wanted to put their finger up and see which way the wind is blowing before they said anything. And there were people calling the congressman every day, no, I want to get you on the record. Are you supporting it? And there was such a mobilization of mass opposition, the whole plan went, George W. Bush never even presented it to Congress. It just went, it may be harder to check the power of the president if you don't hold a branch of government. But I am gonna be mushy and gushy and romantic and say that at the end of the day, I believe that we the people are the ultimate holders of power in the system. I told my students also, the largest mass protest in American history. So people think, Vietnam, whatever it is. The largest mass protest in American history, the same freeze protests against nuclear war in the early 80s. Where, right, troubled by what seemed to be rhetoric aggressive rhetoric towards Russia. It's interesting because Ronald Reagan, as a Republican president, engaged in very aggressive rhetoric towards Russia. Putin, as Republican president-elect, is engaged in much more conciliatory rhetoric towards Russia.
You just called Trump. You just called Trump Putin.
Oh, that was a mistake. Trump, faced by it's on video forever. Trump takes a much more conciliatory posture towards Russia, but troubled by Reagan's very aggressive posture towards Russia, talk about nuclear war and the possibility that it might. Millions of Americans turned out in the streets to protest against that and to say, like, actually, we'd rather not nuclear war, it's all the same to you. And Ronald Reagan shifted a posture, and Mikhail Gorbachev became the premier of the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden we have negotiations and arms control talks and summit meetings and all those kinds of things. So, if you don't like the way things are going, do something about it. There's been a whole conversation that we're not going to have now because the hour is late about how the availability of social media leads us to think that posting something on Facebook is political action. It's not political action. Nothing ever changed because anybody posted anything on Facebook, right? And if you want to engage politically, you gotta do something. Not share with all your friends this scorching hot take about whatever. But that ultimately is the answer. Again, I am an institutionalist. I believe in systems and in working within systems, not in kicking systems down and kicking systems over. I ultimately don't think that really works well for the people we want it to work well for. Okay, we'll end with something Jewish, because why not? In Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah says, Hevei mitpalel b'shloma shel malchut. Pray for the well-being of the government. She'ilmalei, and remember, they were talking about the Roman Empire, you know what I mean? They weren't talking about a democratic, small d, a democratic government in which people had a voice, a government that gave people rights, a government, what's the Roman Empire? It wasn't such good shakes. Why not? Why should you pray? I'm sorry, why? Why should you pray for the well-being of the government? She'ilmalei mora'ah. If not for the fear of government, ish et re'ehu chayim bla'o. One man would swallow his fellow man alive. At the end of the day, as challenging as things may look like they're going to be, people, particularly people who have less power, are better served in frameworks with their institutions and rules and norms, and not where everybody's running wild doing whatever they want. So burn the whole thing down is not, this is my take, you're welcome to disagree with it. Burn the whole thing down is not an approach that holds any appeal for me. Working within the systems and structures and institutions we have to do what good we can is well given.
The next question is how to be
Known as Tikkun Olam.
Sure, if you want, yes.
I'm just curious, do you think the Republicans will agree with Trump and vote with Trump on some of the things that are against Republican?
So the short answer is, on most things, yes. I think that Donald Trump now, again, because he has done this on his own, he has made this happen on his own, he owns the party, and they know it very well. And I think that on many things that he has proposed that are contrary to Republican orthodoxy, they will vote for it. There are a few places where there will be no quarter given, and he, I'm sure, will go along with them there. The thing I am most certain about Trump fulfilling his campaign promises on, of anything, is the Supreme Court. The evangelicals fell in with him because the promise was, Ted Cruz said it, Trump said it to them all the time, he's like, you have to vote for me because of the Supreme Court. He promised them that he would appoint justices who would read the Constitution strictly, which translated into contemporary social issues, means they will vote against abortion rights and they will vote against gay marriage. And that is, I think, one marker. There are a lot of things that if Trump proposed that were contrary to conservative orthodoxy or even to Republican Party orthodoxy, the House and Senate would go along with him on. I think that if he proposed somebody they thought was insufficiently rock-ribbed on those issues, they would reject the nominee, they wouldn't confirm the nominee. And I'm actually totally convinced that he will present to the Senate, to the Republicans in the Senate, nominees that they find acceptable in that area. So that's one place where I think he actually doesn't have. And it's interesting because the one other place in the campaign where he was forced to make a decision it seems that he didn't want to make was for the same purpose, was locking down the evangelical vote, and that was selecting Mike Pence as his VP, when it seems like following his usual pattern, he wanted somebody who was more part of his inner circle. It seems like he wanted Chris Christie as his VP, and he essentially, his hand was forced. He was told, you must get this person who will appeal to the evangelical vote, because Republicans cannot win without the evangelical vote. So I think that's one issue where there will be no bucking, but on many other things, I think, again, it is worth reminding ourselves, he got here entirely on his own. He is entirely his own person. The party is his party now, and I'm really very confident that the Republicans in the House and the Senate are going to go along.
Free trade, too.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to do as much with that, because on planet Earth you can't do as much with that. And he's not taking America out of the World Trade Organization. And therefore many of his most exuberant promises about he's going to do this and that are not going to come to pass. There may be some saber rattling at somebody, China, you're a currency manipulator, and those kinds of things. We've seen that already, but not necessarily concrete action. But in those areas where he wants to take action, he is not going to particularly be constrained by what Republican Party reflects. I mean, look at immigration. Yes.
Many people have said to me,
Excuse me one second. We're well past our time, and if you need to leave, don't feel constrained by the fact that I'm still standing here talking. You're welcome to go.
many people said he's going to be great for Israel. What are they basing this on?
Okay, so I'll tell you, this is a short, I actually didn't talk about Israel at all, because although it is a very big factor in our very small internal communal deliberations, newsflash, it makes no difference. New York and New Jersey both went blue. They were going to go blue anyway, no matter how many Orthodox Jews were a tiny fraction of the Jews in general overwhelmingly voted for Clinton. Orthodox Jews are a tiny population of Jews, and even if they all voted for Trump, not going to make a difference. So it's not, as an issue in the election, it's a non-issue. So here's the story. There's a couple of things to say. One is, there has been a trend developing. It once was it was regarded as a bipartisan truth that politicians from both parties supported Israel and supported Israel equally, and whichever party you voted for, you're going to be good with Israel, and AIPAC invites the candidates from both parties to come speak at AIPAC, like that. Over recent past, for a number of reasons that we could talk about, that has diverged to the point that many Orthodox Jews see Republicans as considerably better for Israel than Democrats. To some extent, that has to do with the marginalizing of the left within Israel and the ascendancy of the right. So if supporting the Israeli government is supporting the government of Bibi Netanyahu, as opposed to in the 1990s, it might have been supporting the government of Yitzhak Rabin, that means going along with and supporting a different set of policies and being comfortable with a different set of policies. There was intense antipathy within the Orthodox world to President Obama for a whole host of reasons. Some perhaps policy, some perhaps personal, but there was intense antipathy to President Obama. There is a long history actually of antipathy, particularly to Hillary Clinton, more than Bill Clinton on these issues, going all the way back to Arafat, all the way back in whenever. And therefore a suspicion that when a Democrat professes strong support of Israel, they don't really mean it. And the Jewish community mobilized very, very, very strongly around the Iran deal. And that got them no place fast. And so the fact that candidate Trump promised to do that, undo that in very short order, was appealing to many people. It cannot be ignored that the economic interests of the Orthodox community, of the modern Orthodox community, not the Haredi community, but the economic interests of the modern Orthodox community that tend to be well off, line up with Republican economic policy as well. So I think that's a factor. To whatever extent that the race and gender issues that we talked about in the broader white electorate are a factor in the Jewish electorate that considers itself white is an interesting thing to consider. I don't think they are a non-factor. Meaning I think considerations of race and gender are a factor within the Orthodox Jewish electorate as well. What's interesting is what doesn't seem to have been a factor within the Orthodox world is the bubbling to the surface of a significant amount of anti-Semitic rhetoric, particularly on social media, by these so-called alt-right people who are, hangers-on to, supporters of, connected to the Trump campaign. Whether that's because modern Orthodox Jews, sort of dismiss that as an issue that's not a real issue, whether they say, well, that's an issue, but they're insignificant, the whole question of Ivanka and Jared Kushner and how that weighs into people's considerations, that does not seem to have been a factor at all, where in the broader Jewish world, that was raised as a concern. The ADL twice over this election cycle, at least twice, maybe 3 times. The Anti-Defamation League is, of course, the major Jewish organization that stands against anti-Semitism and calls it out when they see it. The ADL, at least 2, maybe 3 times this election cycle, sort of addressed the Trump campaign and said things that you're doing or trafficking in echo old anti-Semitic stereotypes. And please don't do that. That didn't land at all in the Orthodox community. It didn't become a source of interest or concern or anything. So anyhow, yes.
Well, I remember that the Gore-Lieberman campaign had a majority of the popular vote, and they lost the election. And now the Clinton-Kaine campaign has just gone through the same experience. Are you aware of other instances where that has happened in a major party presidential campaign?
So there have been other times when the Electoral College, not exactly in this way, but there have been other times when the Electoral College monkeyed with presidential election outcomes. The last time it happened before 2000 was a very long time ago. And so until 2000, everybody was like, that's not a threat, that's not a thing, it's never gonna happen. Then it happened in 2000, I think a lot of people said, well, like, that's a black swan, it comes along once in a bazillion years. Now it's happened twice at a 16-year remove, but now the issue is different. The only way to get, well, that's not true. I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna end, and then if people have other questions, you can ask me. I was gonna say the only way to get rid of the Electoral College is to amend the Constitution. And amending the Constitution is very hard. It has to be proposed either by both houses of Congress or by 2/3 of the states. It has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And since this imbalance both times has cut against Democrats and in favor of Republicans, there's not a lot of incentive to do that. And so amending the Constitution, I would really not think is going to happen here. There is a workaround for the Electoral College. It's not going to happen either anytime soon because it would require the cooperation of Republican-leaning states with Democratic-leaning states, but I'll tell you what it is. Here's the workaround. If you get states whose total number of electoral votes is more than 270, meaning whoever wins that block of states wins the presidency, and all of those states commit that they will give their electoral votes not to the person who won the election in their state, but to the person who wins the popular vote, then you can jerry-rig an end run around the Electoral College. To this point, there are states that represent 100 and some odd electoral votes that have committed to this so-called national popular vote plan. If you could get to 270, you could make that happen. But again, unsurprisingly, to this point, the states that have committed to doing it tend to be blue-leaning states because they are the ones who would like to see this happen. You would need some of the big Republicans, the population-wise, the big Republican-leaning states to commit to doing that as well in order to...
The ERA came close.
Actually, the ERA came very close, but the ERA sunsetted. I think in retrospect that sunset was a terrible mistake, but the ERA sunsetted. Okay, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to take any further questions you have.